for being here tonight. Ellen Woodworth, welcome. Sandra Curry, Rissa, thank you all for being here. Gunwant Braywall from HEU, welcome. Rick Kumar from BCTF, thanks for joining us. So many people here from different affiliations. Welcome to everyone. So today, March 8th, marks the 110th anniversary of the International Women's Day. It's a global day to celebrate the economic, social, and political achievements of women past, present, and future. So much has changed since we last gathered together at the Fraser View Hall a year ago. Feels a little bit longer than a year ago. The global pandemic has changed lives for everyone, especially for women and their families. To speak on this further, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker of the night, Iglika Ivanova. Iglika works as a senior economist and public interest researcher at the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Iglika has produced high impact research on key social and economic challenges facing Canada. She has developed evidence-based policy proposals to build a more just, inclusive, and sustainable economy. Welcome, Iglika.
Thank you, Karen, and good evening, everyone. It's so great to see so many of you here. I see a lot of familiar faces and a lot of people I don't know, which is the perfect mix for the evening. It's a great pleasure to be celebrating International Women's Day with a crowd like this one. It's too bad we can't gather virtually, but hopefully by next year that will become possible. For now, I will start by acknowledging that I am joining today from my home on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation, colonially known as Vancouver. And this is where the work of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives happens as well on these stolen lands. And I think it's important to always think about that as we have these conversations about the impact of pandemic or whatever else on the economy, because we know that we are still living today with the legacy of colonization, which is, you know, a legacy of terrible violence that still impacts the lives of Indigenous people today, and especially Indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about how Indigenous people are disproportionately affected by the pandemic later on in the presentation. But for now, let me share my screen and see if the technology cooperates so that we can get going. Can everyone see my screen? I hope so. Yeah, thumbs up, great, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes or so, and then there will be an opportunity for questions. But if you have questions as you go along, please put them in the chat so that you don't forget them when it comes time to questions, and I'm sure Karen or someone else will keep an eye on that. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, we are a nonprofit independent research institute that is concerned with social, economic, and environmental justice. Our website is policyalternatives.ca, and just today we released a report nationally on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, on the women's participation in the economy. It was called Frontlined and Sidelined, and we'll hear more about why as I go along. But I do encourage you to check out our website. We have a great amount of research on gender issues as well. We have a project nationally called Making Women Count, which is deals with gender equality and is trying to promote sort of gender justice through research. Now, if we've all heard the pandemic recession being referred to as She-Cession. Why is that? Because women are economically bearing the brunt of the pandemic. And that's highly unusual. Usually in recessions, men are the ones who are first to lose their jobs. But this recession has been highly unusual for two reasons. First, the public health restrictions that were required to contain the virus, both in the first wave and now in the second wave, hit disproportionately sectors that employ more women than men. And we're talking about sectors that support tourism, like accommodation and food services, sectors that work in the arts space, culture and recreation, also employ more women than men, and personal services like hairdressing and other such services tend to be, again, employers of women. So those are the kind of sectors that have seen the largest impacts of COVID. And that's why women have lost more jobs than men during the recession. Of course, women also shoulder the vast majority of the additional unpaid care work that COVID created, especially in March and April of last year when schools and childcares were closed across the country. It was women who disproportionately stayed home and took care of their children in Canada, across the country. We saw sort of an entrenchment of the gender division of labor instead of a move to equality here. And a lot of people are worried that this could mean that women's progress in the labor market could be set back by decades because we're entrenching some of those traditional gender roles that we were trying to disrupt before. And for the women who did not lose their jobs, a lot of them are working in low-paid essential jobs that put them at higher risk of infection because they require more contact with the public. To show you a little bit more about that, I've pulled some data from the census. So that the data is quite old now. The last census was 5 years ago in 2016. But due to the fact that Canada actually creates very poor or collects very poor data on racialized workers and where they work, it really only was available in the census once every 5 years until COVID, when it became clear that that is inadequate to monitor what's going on in the economy in real time. And Statistics Canada finally started adding a question about race in the monthly labor force survey that only happened last July. So while other countries have been collecting this data for decades, in Canada, we don't have very good data about where racialized workers work, which sectors. We only have data every 5 years. So here's what the last installment of this data shows us. Here's how to read the data. So the blue line that you see at 49%, just under 50, is the women's share of employment in the total economy. 49% of workers in BC were women in 2016. So if the blue bars are higher than the blue line, this means that women are overrepresented in this sector. Similarly, the red line at 29% is the share of racialized workers in BC employment. So in 2016, there are 29% of workers in BC were people of color. And if the red line in the particular group is higher, if the red bar is higher than that line, that means that racialized workers are overrepresented in that profession. So here's the ones I picked out because they were on the front lines of COVID-19. The one where we see the highest overrepresentation of women is early childhood educators. We have 95% of the workforce is women. And disproportionately more likely to be women of color. We're also seeing nursing, 90% of the workforce is women, home support workers and housekeepers, close to 90%, cashiers, light duty cleaners, respiratory therapists, kitchen helpers and related support occupations in kitchens, laborers in food and beverage processing, that's the second from the last category. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that there were a lot of outbreaks in meat processing plants and in other food processing plants. And we see here that nearly 70% of the workforce in those plants is people of color. This is drastically, drastically overrepresented. And retail, salespeople, again, overrepresentation of women of color and racialized workers. So the workers on the front lines of COVID, the ones who had to bear the risk of infection for themselves and their families, despite being, quite poorly paid in most cases, tended to be women and people of color. And that's a second way in which the pandemic impacted women, besides making them lose their jobs. So, they were either frontlined or sidelined in the labor market, as my colleague said in her report. Now, we saw the importance of care work during the pandemic, and we also saw very clearly that a lot of essential workers may be celebrated as essential, and we clapped for them on our balconies for a while, but they remain underpaid and underprotected. There were conversations over the summer about how too many people are earning in those essential jobs, are earning less than what you can get if you're unemployed and qualify for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB. And the fact that we have embarrassingly high levels of working poverty in this country, I think is something that we haven't talked enough about during the pandemic, and it should be something that we deal with during the recovery. There were short-lived top-ups in some sectors. Grocery stores found themselves generous, some grocery stores, and provided workers with top-up wages for a few months in the kind of first wave of the pandemic, but that got pulled back quite quickly in most cases, and workers remain underpaid. We know a lot of workers, more than 50% of workers in BC don't have access to paid sick leave. That remains a problem, even though we've had a year of pandemic already. Now, I wanted to, because we're here to talk about She-Cession, I wanted to show you the latest charts of what's happening to employment of men and women in Canada. So what this chart shows you is the workers who lost their jobs, or more than half of their regular hours, every month compared to February of 2020. And so the orange line is women, the blue line is men. And you see that in April, at the worst kind of part of the recession, 1/3 of women who were working in February, so 1/3 of women either lost their jobs or were working less than half of their regular hours. Now that's a massive impact. And you see for men, it was slightly smaller, but still quite huge. Canada has never had such a withdrawal from the labor market in previous recessions, since data has been collected, since the Depression. So it's massive impact for both men and women, but particularly for women. And you see that there's a fairly quick recovery over the summer in Canada, but throughout the recovery, women remain at lower levels than men. So they're doing worse than men. And we see here that the recovery stalls in Canada over the fall, and it gets worse in January. That's partially due to the second wave of the pandemic and the fact that some big provinces like Ontario in particular imposed quite strict restrictions and actually closed a lot of non-essential businesses in December and January. So that's causing the drop in employment. And of course, schools were closed, only virtual schools for the whole month of January in Ontario. So that impacted, as you see here, women's participation in the labor market. What about BC? In BC, the story is a bit different. So remember what this looks like. Here's what the story looks like in BC. In BC, women also saw similarly, close to 1/3 drop in the spring, but then women actually recovered at the same pace as men until the summer, and come September, they actually are doing better than men. One of the reasons for that is that, and I'm still investigating why, but Canadian men are doing worse than men in Canada. And part of the reasons is sort of the way the industrial kind of recovery is going. In BC, construction is quite far from recovering to its February levels of activity, while in other provinces, construction has mostly recovered. So I don't know exactly why construction hasn't recovered in BC, but it is a major employer of men. And I think that's partially driving the fact that the recovery for men has been slower in BC than in other parts of the country. And that's making women look good. But before we start, closing this presentation and declaring women's equality done in BC, because as you see, we've recovered here. We need to remember, of course, that that this is recovered compared to February 2020. And it's not like we had gender equality in February 2020. We still had women working much more likely to work part-time jobs than men, likely to work for lower wages, and generally fewer women participating in the workforce than men because they can't access childcare for whatever other reason. So I think it's important to keep in mind that even if we have recovered to February of last year, that's not equality and that's not enough. Now, a big story from this recession is, and I would say almost bigger than the She-Cession, is how poorly low-wage workers did in the recession. It really is the bifurcation by class or by wage is the biggest gap that we're not talking enough about. So what I show you here in this chart is, again, the workers who lost their jobs or more than half of their regular hours, but by wage. And the blue line shows you the bottom 1/4 of workers. They earn less than $18 an hour in BC. And the orange line shows you the top 1/4 of workers, and they earn more than $36 an hour in BC. So what you see here is that in April, 50% of workers, of low-wage workers, those earning less than $18 an hour, lost their jobs or more than half of their regular hours. That is enormous. And then the recovery has been much slower, and basically since September has stalled for those low-wage workers. And they're still at about 10% less employment than they were in February 2020. In contrast, high-paid workers barely saw a drop in the spring, came down to some lower hours, almost 10%, by summer, and now have fully recovered and in fact have 10% higher employment than they did in February 2020. And so when you read this chart, you should also remember that women are disproportionately concentrated in the lower paid jobs and men are, predominant in the higher paid jobs. So there's an extra layer of gender inequality in that this chart hides. But the gap is very big. And now I wanted to break it down further. So each of those lines, the low wage workers and the high wage workers, to see how men and women in those wage categories compare. So this is what the next two charts shows. And it shows us that even though for women in general, there hasn't been a She-Cession as much in BC, for low wage women, there is a She-Cession. So low wage women earning less than $18 an hour experience bigger drops than low wage men and have recovered much slower than men in the same wage group. So you're seeing here, this is the story of the She-Cession. If you just look at all women and all men, you don't see it, but you need to break down the data into look at the low wage workers, because it is low wage women who really have borne the brunt. Now, what about very high wage women, those earning more than $36 an hour? Turns out they also are experiencing somewhat of a She-Cession, but obviously much less so than low wage women. But you're seeing here that since the summer, men earning in the top 1/4 of wages have seen gains in employment, while women, are doing much less well, even at the top. So while they're obviously doing much better than low wage women, there's still a gender gap at the very top as well. So I think that's important to remember when you see, because you will start seeing very soon, the business groups saying, oh, we've recovered. Oh, don't worry, there's no gender problems. Women are working higher hours than February. They're doing better than men. This is what you need to remember. Low-wage women are not doing so well. Of course, the challenges are not just, divided by low-wage and high-wage women. There's an equal impacts of divided by immigrant status, by disability, by race, by, you know, all sorts of social identities, intersecting social identities. And I'm going to show you a few. These numbers are all from Ontario, and they're from today's report that my colleague Catherine Scott released. The women with young children, in particular, single mothers, experienced huge drops in participation in the workforce. They exited the workforce. In Canada, 39% of single mothers with children under the age of 6, or rather single mothers with children under the age of 6 were working 39% fewer hours than they had before the pandemic. In BC, we can't get that same data because the sample sizes are too small. There's too few working mothers, single mothers with children under 6 to be able to get reliable estimates. So we have to rely on the Canadian data. Single mothers of school-aged children, 6 to 12, were doing a bit better, but they're also working less than February. And so in general, we see these patterns across all provinces that if you disaggregate women into parents, you know, and non-parents, mothers of young children, in particular single mothers, are doing worse. Of course, we also had big drops in employment and hours for young women aged 15 to 24, and for older women aged 54 and over. So we have all sorts of inequalities among women. Racialized women are disproportionately impacted. Again, statistics for Canada. In July 2020, unemployment rate for white women was 9%, 9.2%. And for racialized women, it was almost double at 17.4%. July, as I mentioned before, was the first month the data was collected. So that's as, you know, as in the middle of the recession as we can get, because there's no earlier data. Now the gap has closed. You know, Statistics Canada does not release data by province, by gender, only for all racialized workers by province. Again, it's problematic. We need much better data collection. But from the overall data on racialized unemployment, it's higher in BC as the unemployment rate of white people. But the race gap in BC is a bit lower than it is in Canada. So we're doing slightly better when it comes to including racialized workers in the labor market, but we still have a gap. Indigenous workers, again, is another area where the data is not very good. So I can't get you charts like I can for low-wage workers and for men and women, because the data is not available at that level. So what I can do is look at how many people were working in 2020 compared to 2019. You know, gets us close, more or less, shows us the pandemic. And you can see here that women in BC, so the orange bars are all women, and the top 3 are BC. In women, it didn't seem to matter whether you're an Indigenous woman or a non-Indigenous woman. You experienced a pretty big employment loss compared to 2019. Men, however, there is a very big employment loss among Indigenous men, which is in BC, which we don't see in other provinces. Again, I don't know exactly why the data isn't, you know, available, disaggregated enough to be able to tell. I suspect it's around the sectors that are impacted, like construction and transportation, that perhaps employ more Indigenous men, that are causing this big gap in BC that doesn't exist in the rest of the country. But in the rest of the country, Indigenous women are doing worse than Indigenous men. In BC, Indigenous men seem to be doing quite poorly compared to compared to everyone else, really. So that's, you know, the data we have. Again, very poor, you know, poor quality data. We should collect better data on these marginalized groups, and I hope that's one silver lining of COVID, that we are starting to collect slightly better data. Now, of course, I just want to bring us all back to the fact that pre-COVID gender gaps existed, and Canada, you know, wasn't the leader by any means. We were 19th in the world, according to the latest World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Report. It's from 2020, but really it's from 2019. It was issued in December 2019. And you see here that the leaders in terms of gender equality are the Nordic countries, no surprises, also New Zealand. Maybe some of you are surprised to see Nicaragua there. But, you know, the important bit here to note is that full equality would be, the index would be 1. So no country, not even Iceland and the Nordic countries have achieved full equality, gender equality, when Canada is number 19. So, you know, this is an improvement actually from 5 years ago when I was doing similar presentation and Canada was 35th. So, you know, there has been some improvement with this federal government and with the provincial governments we've had recently, introducing some positive changes, having, you know, better political representation of women, but we're still far to go. I want to kind of finish up with a little bit of a discussion to get the kind of Q&A or discussion going with some thoughts about what's holding women back and what we need during the recovery. So I would argue that it's outdated public policy that's holding women back, that we don't have appropriate childcare and seniors care systems that really allow women to participate fully in the workforce and to access training. And we saw during the pandemic the vital importance of caregiving and how much of it is unpaid or very poorly paid. And that's something that I think the state needs to take more responsibility for, and we're seeing some moves in that direction. I think it's really important, as I highlighted in my presentation of the data, that racialized, indigenous, and low-income people are the ones who have borne the brunt of the pandemic. I think it's really important as we design policies for recovery that those are policies that benefit exactly those groups the most, and investing in care and in the care economy will provide the biggest benefits for low-income families and for women and for those underrepresented groups, because they are the ones who rely on these services and who can't purchase them in the private market. They're also the people who work providing those services. So expanding the public provision of childcare and improving working conditions in seniors care really would benefit the most those racialized low-wage women workers that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. And so it's vital as we invest in those jobs, and we are seeing now big promises of large amounts of federal dollars going to childcare, you know, maybe reform of seniors care sector. And as we do these things, it's crucially important that the jobs we're creating are family supporting jobs, that they have benefits, that they have paid sick leave, that they have good wages, and that they allow workers to unionize. You know, unprecedented crisis call for unprecedented solutions and for boldness. I think we need to really harness this recognition of the importance of care work and bring it forward in our public policy making. We need to invest in large scale expansions of those systems of care in BC and in Canada. We need to overhaul our workplace rights and protections and the system of enforcement so that those low wage workers actually have better wages and protections, and we deal with working poverty once and for all. We need to promote policies that better value and compensate workers. You know, we saw a lot of people do really important work. You know, they're essential for our survival, and yet they make poverty level wages. And often they don't have access to unionization. So it's really important to expand access to unionization in those low paid occupations that are very precarious and have very, very poor working conditions often. We also need to overhaul our income support system. We saw very clearly that our unemployment insurance system is completely inadequate and leaves far too many people behind. We also need to overhaul our welfare and disability support systems where people are expected to live on much, much less than what CERB provided to unemployed people. I think we need to take that CERB line of $2,000 a month and use it as the new kind of floor for benefits and say, this is what's acceptable in Canada in the 21st century, in the year 2021, $2,000 a month. And this is what people should get. If they can't support themselves through work, they should get that through welfare, through disability, and through yeah, as a minimum. And that's what, coincidentally will bring you about at the level of the poverty line in BC. We need to curb inequality by increasing tax fairness. I think one of the things we saw in the pandemic, I didn't have a lot of time to talk about this here, but we saw that the stock market's very resilient. People invest in the stock market, continue to make lots of money. And billionaires are having no problem with the pandemic. The top 44 Canadian billionaires made $53 billion in the first 6 months of the pandemic alone. We're seeing, companies like Amazon, a lot of the grocery store chains, like really breaking it in with the pandemic, and at the same time lobbying for low taxes and all sorts of other breaks. I think it's really important to ask those who have benefited from the pandemic to pitch in quite a bit more to make up for the fact that the pandemic has increased existing inequalities. It has increased income inequality, wage inequality, and a lot of people are really struggling. So in order to fund these kind of awesome policies that will help the people who are hurt the most by the pandemic, someone needs to pay for them. And this someone should be the people who are able to keep their jobs and work from home and save on transportation and travel and entertainment, as well as the billionaires and the large companies. I should mention, I'm sure a lot of you know, that a lot of companies, large companies that received the federal wage subsidy at the same time paid dividends, a large amounts of dividends to their shareholders with essentially with public dollars. And I think that was a big mistake the federal government made by not putting limits on companies who receive wage subsidies to not do that. So huge inequalities in the pandemic. It has expanded inequalities between countries, within countries, between families, across all sorts of lines. And I think we need to collect better data to be able to understand the problem better. So if you want to know a little bit more about the Canadian situation, I will shamelessly plug this event my colleague is doing. It's happening on Friday at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. PST. It's called Frontlines and Sidelines: What's Next for the Women in the Economy. So it's a way to continue the conversation past the Q&A. But in the meantime, I'll leave this slide up for a little while and I can take questions. Well, I can't see the chat, so someone will have to give me the question.
Thank you, Iglika. That was an eye-opening presentation. So I see some questions in the chat already. If you haven't put your question in the chat, go ahead and do that. Moderating this part of the Q&A is Joey Hartman. As many of you know, Joey is a retired president of the VDLC. So take it away, Joey.
Thanks, Karen, and thanks, Iglika, so much for the presentation. And I'm sure that while you were talking, you could see stuff flashing up in front of you on the chat, and there was a lot of things that people are eager to know. And to really, I think there's a really strong sense that what you've done is provided sort of the real structure to what we all really have a strong sense of, is that women and the BIPOC and immigrant and Indigenous women in particular have really carried the brunt of this, but you've really given some solid statistical information. I'm going to tell you some of the questions that have come up as we have been listening to you. Some of them are pretty straightforward. One was from Ellen Woodsworth, is when is the government's next set of information going to be available? So you indicated it was every 5 years. So when will we next have access to the federal data?
Yeah, so the census happens in May. So the next one's happening in May this year, 2021, and then the data will start trickling in over the next couple of years. Yeah.
And how current will that be?
There will be as of 2021,
Okay.
So. But we are starting, I am complaining because you can't do historical kind of comparisons, but as of July, we are now collecting data and we'll have monthly data on racialized workers and their unemployment rate. And while Statistics Canada doesn't release a lot of it for free yet, you can order it and you can get special tables. So it's possible to get some of it. I just didn't have a chance to do that for this presentation because it takes a little while. But More data is becoming available. The pandemic really has highlighted the whole summer of racial tensions in the US and here have really highlighted the fact that we need to do better and collect this data for economic statistics, but for social statistics as well. And so now there's data on mortality as well by COVID. We can see mortality by race, and we can see that it is higher in every province for racialized people. There's higher mortality from COVID. Though the good news for BC is that, again, we're doing slightly better than everyone else, but it's still higher for racialized people than for white people.
Right. The next question is from Marion Pollock, and she highlighted that women who are retired are already much more likely to be living in, poverty or very low economic standing. And she wondered if this is going to be exacerbated, particularly looking down the road into the women who are going to be retiring in the future, and whether or not CPP, of course, because it's attached to contributions and wages while you were working, what do you foresee with regard to women as retirees in the future?
That's a great question, Marian. Thank you for that. And you're right. I mean, CPP is determined on the basis of your earnings like every single year. So for women, 2020 represents a hit, as you saw, huge hits in April. And even though now a lot of us focus on, but we've recovered to February, like there was a big gap, and that gap in earnings is a gap that will remain in your pensions, in CPP forever. And so, yes, it is a problem, especially for women who are over 55. And I didn't show graphs because I didn't want to overwhelm you, because you can show graphs for anything. But women over 55 also have largely, experienced big declines in employment and dropping out of the labor market. And again, that's reducing their pensions and putting them at higher risk of poverty. So I do think that this will become an issue. It depends on how fast the recovery proceeds and what happens next year. Like, how fast can we get over the lockdowns and start bringing people back, because otherwise this will have lasting impact. Right.
The next one is pretty straightforward. I think you'll be able to answer this one easily. Are these graphs and charts and the analysis available on the CCPA BC website?
Not yet, not all of them. Because the new data comes out every month. Of course, I made you folks charts with the latest available as of January. There's older stats on our website. I am writing a report right now about kind of assessing the state of the BC economy a year into the pandemic, like where we're at. It will include more than just the gender inequality stats, but it will include the gender inequality stats. So that will be coming out maybe in the next month sometime. So that will have like all the charts put together neatly. But for now, I can send you the slides, but they are custom made for you, with the latest available data.
Thank you. And that question was from Jane Dury, by the way. I also note that Caitlin had put in the chat that this is being recorded and will be available on the Vancouver District Labour Council's website. So if you wanted to, anybody on this wants to share it with folks who were not able to make it, or just to refresh your memory on some of the details that you were able to see, you can certainly go to the VDLC website later and see this. There was also a question about what you might predict in terms of, I know you pay a lot of close attention to government policy. And the question is whether or not, because this is so much of an impact on women relative to men, and the traditional way of dealing with recovery is to put a lot of money into big mega projects, for example. The question is, do you think it might be possible to persuade the government to do infrastructure projects related to social infrastructure? So things like childcare and looking at some of the other items that you've highlighted as being necessary for a She-Covery.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think we're still seeing that, and we saw it a lot last summer, but we're still seeing huge emphasis on shovel-ready projects. more emphasis than I think is necessary. But there's no problem with building more hospitals and roads and bridges. I mean, we need that. A lot of infrastructure is aging. We need to upgrade. So it's great if governments want to invest in that, but that can't be everything. And usually it has been everything. The good news is that now in Canada, there is near universal recognition that childcare and like a huge investment in childcare needs to be part of a recovery for the recovery to actually work. And I think for the first time in a really long time, the federal government is prepared to invest serious money in childcare. I mean, they invested in the last 3 years ago. They had $7.5 billion over 11 years. But when you actually break it down by year and by province, it worked out to very small amounts of money, considering the needs. So, it's some of you who have worked on this for a long time would remember that 15 years ago, Canada came close to having a childcare program. The Paul Martin government had negotiated bilateral agreements with the provinces. I think it was in 2006. But then the Conservatives got elected, and the first thing they did was scrap those. So we came so close to having a program, 15 years ago. And now I think it's actually going to happen. We heard today that the federal budget won't be announced until sometime later in April. So we'll have to wait until then. But I do expect to see a massive amount of money invested in childcare, like much more so than previously. And that is hugely important because in BC, even though our government has been more aware of these issues and investing in childcare since the provincial, the NDP and Greens kind of coalition came to power in 2017, having significant federal funds will really help us do more faster, and it will be a huge benefit to childcare in BC. So I'm very excited about that. I think we are seeing childcare for seniors care. I really hope and a lot of people are putting pressure federally to see national standards on seniors care, because we saw just how big the gaps in quality of service are between provinces and within provinces between private for-profit operators of seniors care and nonprofit and public operators. And we had huge tragedies and so much unnecessary preventable deaths that happened in those for-profit seniors care providers that I think, I really hope that this leads to some long-term change. Here in BC, we have a commitment to, level up wages. We saw with the single site order in long-term care. And of course, some of the people here in the audience know a lot more about this than me, but we saw that the workers, when we banned the workers from working in multiple establishments, as you know, that was before jobs were precarious. A lot of people couldn't get enough shifts in one long-term care center. They had to work in several. So they spread infection between different facilities. And so when a single site order was issued that you can only work in one place, people were guaranteed full-time hours and were given the union, wages. And a lot of them were earning a lot less than that. So I think there's a commitment to keep those kind of leveled up wages going forward and to really kind of even out the working conditions in for-profit and nonprofit sectors, which, does beg the question of why we have these for-profit operators who can't pay properly and need the government to pay higher wages. But right. That's the question for another day. My point is, I do think we're going to see more investment than we have in the past, but I think it's not necessarily a done deal, and I think advocacy is hugely important. Last night, there was a big similar event celebrating International Women's Day by the Childcare Coalition of BC, Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC, and they're doing a lot of work on childcare. I know a lot of work is being done on seniors care, and we need to keep the pressure in order to get these things done. Because the other thing that's really important, and I will finish with that, is that when the government puts these large amounts of money on the table, it's advocacy that will make sure that they get spent right, that they get spent on building public quality spaces with good wages and working conditions, and don't just become handouts to for-profit operators, we know just don't provide the same quality services.
Which is something we've certainly seen before. It's not just the what, but the how.
Yeah, and that's where I think our job will be over the next little while.
Yeah, to be monitoring that. There was a federal announcement of a task force that is a gender task force. Is that something that you have some confidence in? Because certainly some of the names that I've seen of who are going to be the advisors of very prominent women from across the country are women that I totally trust in terms of being able to make the right arguments. But do you think they're up against a structure that's going to be possible for them to succeed in long-term change?
I hope so. I hope so. I was excited to see a number of the names as well this morning being announced. Of course, it all matters on how willing the federal government is to listen to the recommendations of these women. I don't doubt that they will make excellent recommendations now. As we know, not many of the recommendations that task forces make don't go anywhere. So I think, again, I would say this is the role of labor and the role of progressive advocates to push and to make sure that that if those recommendations are good, then yes, government feel pressure to have to implement them.
And of course, everybody has an MP across the country, a member of parliament who is supposed to be responsive to you and your interests. So everybody, I hope, will be writing an email as well. I have a question from Anisha, who is thanking you for all of the statistical information, but has a question regarding the reliability and accuracy of the samples and the sample sizes that have informed the charts and the presentation. So you obviously are working with the information that's available, but do you?
Yeah, the charts that I showed you are reliable. Their sample sizes are big enough. When they are not reliable, I haven't done charts. And what you will see, if you're interested, you can look me up and I'll show you. It looks like up and down going all over the place because when you have very small samples, and the next month is someone else answering the survey, if 3 people change their answer, it becomes like 40% change. So, but everything I showed you, for total number of women and men and in some of the bigger groups, you can, and the low wage workers, high wage workers, when you look at the bottom 1/4 of workers, the sample is big enough, definitely reliable. All these charts that I show you are accurate and reliable.
Okay, well, that's reassuring. There was a question about, this comes to the question about how governments make choices, and sometimes we're presented with the idea of if you don't spend it on one thing, you might have it for the other. So it was posed as a question about, do you happen to know what the federal government is currently investing in their defense spending? And would it equate to one of these items that you've identified as being important, such as childcare, pharmacare, seniors care, housing, those kinds of things? Is that something that you look at, or do you tend to stay away from that kind of an analysis?
To be honest, I mostly work on provincial level issues. And so I don't know off the top of my head what the defense budget is because it's a federal issue. My colleagues do put out, an alternative federal budget where they closely look at, what the federal government spends their money on and what can be optimized. But of course, I'm sure that there is money that both federal and provincial governments spend that can be used better. And I would say I would look at a lot of subsidies to businesses. For example, in BC, I know that we give a lot of tax credits, or tax subsidies to the oil, to the gas sector for, drilling oil, gas wells, and a lot of them go to very profitable enterprises. So it is quite questionable why they need those subsidies. So that's one area. I'm sure, we've all heard about the policing in carceral states and the state and how damaging that is to so many people, and how maybe we need to optimize police budgets as well and use some of those for community services that would make our communities much safer and more inclusive than the police budget. So that's something that's worth looking into as well.
Right, thank you. So I guess there's so many questions we could be asking you, and this is a conversation that could go on. but we also want to be sensitive to time. We said that this would be approximately an hour. So just to give one or two more questions, there's the Toronto Star today was basically saying that there's been so many, 500,000 women who lost their jobs in Canada because of the pandemic, and who have not returned to work as of January. And in fact, so many of them, 100,000 women, have really just stopped looking. So they're dropped off of even those unemployment ranks. And it really is suggesting that women who, well, really all of the people who are anything but the sort of top rung have lost a lot of ground that may take as much as a loss of 30 years of really very strenuous work to try and make the gains that have been made. Do you have a sense that this is going to be a long, long time before we're able to, and only if the right intentions are put in place, to move us back to where we were a year ago?
I definitely see, why people are concerned, and there are some indications. Again, in BC, the numbers aren't quite as dire, but federally, as in nationally across the country, it does look like a lot of women are dropped out of the workforce. And when you look at the rate of women who are employed, like the percentage of all women who are employed, it's now at the rates that it was in 1999, for Canada. So that's a long time. And that's where people say, we've lost decades of progress. I am, of course, I think we would take a really long time if we don't take any measures, but I see commitment for childcare, commitment to all these other programs to really assist people. So I think that is what's gonna kind of shorten the path back. And I think the investment in childcare, especially, it's not going to be instantaneous. Of course, we know that to build new childcare spaces, they're not going to pop up tomorrow. It's going to take a few years. It's going to take time to train early childhood educators. But I think the goal here and the hope is that BC and Canada can come out of this in a few years and be stronger than we were before the recession, and have better equality for women and for racialized workers, for Indigenous workers, for low-income workers, and solve some of those social problems that we had ignored. Because I think that one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that I think it used to be much easier to turn a blind eye to those inequalities and pretend they don't exist. And now I think they really have been amplified and have become visible for everyone. And it's no longer possible to sweep them back under the rug. So I think we're now in the process of actually addressing them and doing policy, in an inclusive way. And I hope to see some positive change in the years that come.
Well, that's really encouraging. And I think that a lot of what you have done over many years of work is to give people the information to back the arguments that they're going to be making. You spoke earlier about, the labor movement and other advocates for positive social change, and quite a long list of things that would make a big difference. So you talked about paid sick leave, you talked about having living wages in place as an expectation, the ability to unionize, be made less barriers to it to make it possible, because of course that impacts people's ability to have improvements in their working life and their home life. So I guess the question I would have to finish off with you is based in your experience and all of the people who are on the call today, is what would you encourage us to do to help motivate things in the right direction?
That's a great question. I do have to say that I've always been optimistic, but I've never been quite as optimistic as I am now about the rate of change. I do think this pandemic has created a huge opening, that it is a generational opportunity to see some really big changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for a generation. So I think we're talking here with childcare about setting up an entirely new social program, which is not something that we do all the time in this country. We're talking about pharmacare, maybe, some other expansions in healthcare. So I think there is great opportunity right now to make some big steps forward, and not just tinkering around the margins like we normally do, but some kind of radical reforms and large scale investments of the likes of which we don't normally see. So I'm very optimistic. I think what we can do as citizens, as activists in labor movements, in our own unions, is keep the conversation going and really kind of push governments in any way we can through, contacting them directly, or getting involved in the conversation in media, but really just getting involved with the conversation with your family and coworkers to change people's minds to support these initiatives, which really are not just the right thing to do, but also what's going to set us up for greater kind of prosperity going forward. And it is the smart thing to do, no matter how you look at it, from a social justice perspective or from a purely economic perspective, because you just can't have a recovery with so many women dropping out of the workforce. You need all hands on deck. You need to fully use the potential of all citizens. So I think we need to have the conversation. We need to challenge some of the myths that come up, that we can't afford it, or or that some of those structural inequalities are due to individuals making their own choice, and what we need to do is educate the individuals to make better choices. We know it's not about individual choices. We know it's about structural barriers and systemic issues. So let's have systemic solutions. And I think we are closer than we've ever been in my 13 years of working in public policy to seeing some big progressive change. So I'm very excited.
Well, that's a very hopeful note to end on. And I really appreciate you having taken the time not only to share this information with us tonight, but also to have really dedicated your working life to making positive change around us by bringing us this really important and crucial information. So I'm just going to say thank you so much and turn it back to Karen to wish everybody, I want to wish everybody a happy International Women's Day. And the first conversation I'm going to have when I get off this call is to start talking with others about the things that you've identified for us as so important and useful. Karen, over to you.
Thanks, Joey, and thanks, Iglika, for doing that. We're nearing the end of our program, so I don't want to take too much more of your time. I'd like to take this opportunity and thank the VDLC Women's Committee for organizing tonight's event and having me as a moderator. On behalf of the VDLC Women's Committee, we thank you all for joining us tonight, and hopefully we can see you all next year in person. We're going to play the special presentation that was created by Caitlin, so you may see some familiar faces, so stay tuned. Stay safe and have a good night, everyone.
There's an old friend that I once heard say something that touched my heart, and it began this way. I was born by the river in a little tent, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. He said it's been a long time coming, but I know my change is gonna come. Oh yeah. He said it's been too hard living time coming, but I know my change has got to come. Oh yeah. I went to my brother and I asked him, brother, could you help me please? He said, good sister, I'd like to, but I'm not able. And when I looked around, I was right back down on my bended knee. Yes, I was. Oh, every time that I thought that I wouldn't last for long. But somehow, right now, I believe that I'm able to carry on. I tell you that it's been a long